is, of course, is relatively easy, but it's a team production technology, so it's not that easy to incentivize people individually. It is often a product that people care a lot about, and both the clients and also the workers. And they have, at least in Germany, the positive side that you usually have a lot of units. So in terms of statistical power, you can do nice RCTs. And that's what we did here. Is this really needed? A bad bun? Because it's bakeries, you might wonder whether the sort of, pretty intensive workplace control that we find in some of these places, but also in the McDonald's of this world and in general catering and so on, but also services, you find a lot of checklists. And we were interested to what extent these checklists are good or whether they're trade-offs, and that's what we actually did. My co-authors are Matthias Heinz and Nick Silbanov, with whom I've worked for a very long time. Mitch Hoffman, also written a few papers with him, and Toby Kretschmer. And now again, it doesn't want to flip, so I need to do this. Good. So one way of thinking about this is that workplace control might be something very productive. At least the theorists like Taylor and Fayol in the early 20th century made a very good point that you want to raise efficiency by workplace control and, of course, division of labor. So that's great. But then the next step in some way was to say, okay, let's have checklists, because then it's not only that you can control people by saying, look, you have to follow certain rules and you have to check these things. So to, for instance, have the same kind of quality wherever you are. But people also might not forget things, which is good for themselves. If you think of a surgeon, you probably want the surgeon not to forget very important steps. Each time you are in a plane, you can be sure that the pilots go through the same checklist like at least 3 or 4 times to make sure that the plane is in a good state. But there might be trade-offs. For instance, when people fill in a lot of paperwork, they may not have enough time for other things. And then there might also be a more behavioral channel that says, when I'm forced to use a checklist, maybe that means that the firm or my principal doesn't trust me. It might be an annoying thing, and it might implement negative cultures. So, in principle, we hear a lot from people who believe that they are subject to over-control. Also, in some universities, people complain, probably right they are, that they have to fill all kind of reports on how they use their time, and they have to hand in the evaluation sheets of their students and all kind of stuff. And we tend to not like that. So while there might be this sort of impression that this is not just good, but could also have trade-offs, it's very hard to measure these trade-offs because they're non-random, they're heterogeneous returns, and many different types of checklists. So we thought it makes sense to zoom in on a production function that is relatively easy, in which we pretty much uh, can measure to what extent things are efficient or not, but we can also measure how people think about certain workplace practices, and we have the ultimate measure of whether people like a place or not, which is their decision to stay in a firm or to leave. And that's what we're going to use. So it's a large German bakery chain. It has over 100 million in annual sales, 145 stores, thousands of workers, very granular admin data. And they also allowed us to do our kind of surveys. So this is very much like a mixed method a paper in which the core is an RCT. And we have a lot of archival data and performance data to link this to, but we also try to find out how people feel about certain things, their impressions, their perceptions, to give a more complete view. So what we did, what is the RCT? The RCT is that we looked very carefully at the checklists that existed in this firm, and then after long discussions, removed two of them. So the treatment is very simple. The treatment is that roughly half of the stores will have two of these checklists removed. The first one is a so-called operational checklist. That's something that people sign every day. And some of that stuff is honestly borderline humiliating. I'm going to show you some examples of that. And then there's a daily protocol that is quite time consuming, but also has a few important data points that are exchanged between shifts in the same store. And again, I'm going to show you what this looks like. And the treatment is then that for some stores, these are removed. What are the main results? And maybe after the main results, if you have any questions, let me know. We document wide variation in the value across checklists. So we worked really hard with the firm, with a task force to look at all these checklists and discuss them and think about what value they might give. Then the removing two of the checklist results in sales by raised by sales by 2.7%. It reduces the manager attrition, and here manager means a store manager. So this is not a high-ranked manager, but a store manager who runs the store. Their attrition goes down by 2%, by 2/3, excuse me. And in the Google reviews, that's very nice. I mean, it seems that people care so much about baked goods that they fill in Google reviews on that. In the treated stores, actually faster lines are reported and more appealing products. So if anything, the quality of the service goes up and not down. And that, of course, is interesting because checklists are usually introduced to assure quality of service. Then treated workers report greater commitment to the firm and perceived trust by the headquarters. But what is really interesting are the bullet points 3 and 4. The first one is we find highly heterogeneous treatment effects. And in particular, we find that the treatment effects are largest where the regional managers, so these are the supervisors to the stores, predicted that the RCT will work even before they knew the treatment status of these stores. So we asked them, imagine we would do this and that. Do you think that the store would benefit or not? And if yes, why? So they seem to know quite well what's going on. And we find that very interesting for the understanding of organizations. So it seems that valuable information resides in lower ranks of the hierarchy. So at the middle management level, these regional managers can be understood as middle managers. These guys know stuff, which, however, the CEOs don't use. And I find that quite interesting. And then when the firm saw the results, they were sort of happy, but they still said one of these checklists should go back again, that they would use it, that they find it useful. The other one could stay out. And we can actually see that once this happened, treatment and control groups get a little bit more similar again, just as we would expect. Good. If there are no questions, maybe this is a way to think of it. As you see, this is very much from the perspective of organizational economics. So on the one hand side, we have quite a lot of RCTs and also lab experiments on monitoring. We find that very useful literature, and the main difference here is that we remove checklists rather than introducing additional monitoring technologies. Moreover, we think that for the real world, for real organizations, it's very important to understand what sort of instruments might actually be harmful and what sort of instruments maybe not. And that's the first part of the paper in which we identify the ones that are potentially least beneficial. Then management practices in general, there's huge literature on that. What we have learned from this very interesting and deep literature is that management practices and managers matter, but that it might depend much on the context. And when we think about why managers may matter, then it could actually be that they have important private information. And the fact that we find that regional managers are quite able to predict where checklist removal will work and where not points to private information of these guys being important, which of course then begs the question, why does the firm not talk more with these regional managers and give them more authority or more discretion about the intensity of this sort of workplace control? And then finally, we have something to say about expert predictions in surveys, smaller literature, and our paper is one of the first RCTs to elicit beliefs on success by treated unit and not overall. Good. So what I'm going to do in the next maybe 40 minutes or so, maybe a bit less so that we still have time to talk, is give you the conceptual framework, which is very intuitive, talk to you about the experimental design and data, show you the effects overall, show you the heterogeneity, briefly talk about firm-wide rollout, and then talk a bit about what we learn and what we don't learn here. Here's a very simple way of thinking of what checklists do. If you bring in checklists, then what you try to do is you try to solve problems and potentially solve them or prevent them before they even happen. However, they can be time-consuming, unpleasant, and they may be a signal to workers that I don't really trust you. So from the work by Ellingsen and Johannessen, which has inspired us also to some other papers, to write some other papers, we know that workers care about being esteemed by firms. And in particular, you might get utility from thinking that the firm thinks that you're altruistic, that you're a good worker, or that you're a skillful worker with good memory or good judgment. And then what that means is the checklist will be more costly when they send a more intensive negative signal that the worker might be selfish, dumb, has poor judgment, or bad memory. I mean, in some ways, this is a variant of a Benabuti-Roll world in which the principal is signaling something, but then you take more like this view of the worker who interprets what the principal might be doing if they have these checklists and also what they might be doing if actually they remove them. Very simple model. Super simple model would then look as follows. You say there is a problem that can arise with a certain probability P in a given store. So let's just think here about one given store, and the manager is the regional manager. Then if you use the checklist, you can catch this problem with probability M. You have a direct cost of a checklist, which is C, which would, for instance, be the time cost, or you have to store the stuff in paper and whatnot. And there might be an indirect cost, which would be theta, and that would be a psychological cost. Then when you remove a checklist, you would have the return in this given store equals C, because you don't have to pay that much anymore for the technology, plus theta, but minus MP times K, where M is the reduction of the problem, for instance, that a sandwich might not taste good. And that is what you trade off. So you're trading off the direct and indirect cost with the potential increase in problems. So the upper manager then, that would be the regional manager, will get a signal about this potential return, but that will be noisy. That signal will have a precision of 1 over the variance of the distribution of the signal. And then the manager, when asked whether they believe that this will work or not, might have some kind of threshold in mind such that they would say, yes, it will work. And then from this super simple model, you will get two main predictions that we can test. The first one is that the overall treatment effect of removal will be positive if the cost parameters are high or if MP and K are low. And that, for instance, means that probably very experienced stores or very experienced workers might have a lower probability of running into a problem because they have all kind of routines. And by the same time, they may have a higher psychological cost of being subjected to checklist. So consequently, it would be these stores that should show the highest effects, or these managers or these employees that should show the highest effect, for instance, in terms of the turnover decision. And then the other story is that if managers have useful information about where it might help and where it might not help, then what we should see is more or less, this is what this says, that the treatment effect in stores in which regional manager says that it should work particularly well should be higher than in those stores in which he says this will not work. So that's the two things that we can test. Good. So here's the design. So it's a large bakery chain in a densely populated German region. I'm not telling you where it is. It's quite typical. I mean, half of these chains are family owned. The other half is more very often owned by financial institutions or bigger groups. These guys have a reputation for quality. The CEO himself is an educator, is a trained baker, and built this up from scratch. So he is quite proud about his quality in these stores. 2K workers, roughly 13 workers per store. Employee attrition was around 20% per year, and the firm began to be a little bit concerned about the turnover of people, and in particular of people who were trained. Christian knows how the German education system works. So you have these vocational schools where people learn a trade, and it's not that easy to replace these people who have learned how to run a bakery with somebody who has not been trained. In the 2018 employee survey, there was widespread dissatisfaction, in particular with the control systems and the checklists, and that led us to get together with these guys. They asked us whether we could help. We put together a project team of two of the co-authors, Matthias and me, heads of HR, employees from two departments, the sales director and the head of the workers' council, which is something that we can talk another time. Germany has these workers' council that can be both heaven and hell. That's an example store. So you see this was during COVID. You see the bread in the background. You see cake, etc. in the foreground. What you don't see is on the right-hand side, you have a coffee machine. You can sit down and enjoy your coffee, and they also make fresh sandwiches and so on. So it's also an interesting lunch place to go. Okay, how did we find out which workplace practices could be potentially harmful? Okay, we sat down with the working group, made the full list of 22 checklists. So 22 is a lot. And sometimes some members in this team said, "Oh, I'm surprised that that checklist still exists." So we went through it, and then we asked 21 store managers and 18 workers about how they perceived the benefit of these checklists. Summary, there's a lot of heterogeneity, and summary workers say they spend a lot of time. Probably they overestimate the time here, but still it is substantial, the time that they spend on these. And here's a way to show you the usefulness or not usefulness of these checklists. So on the x-axis, you have the time in minutes per week. And on the y-axis, you have like sort of an aggregate measure for whether or not people believe that these checklists achieve the goals of the firm. And you see a lot of heterogeneity. And without wanting to go through all these, you have a few that stand out. So, I mean, you rather want the ones in the east of the graph because they are time consuming. And so, as you see, we identified daily protocol and operational checklists. Why? Because the baking time checklist was something, and also the sample roll and the quality of baking was something that the firm was unwilling to remove. To just tell you, the sample roll is a very funny thing. Every weekend, people have to put a bag with a few rolls together, which will then, and then they have to sign that they've done that. It will be picked up by a driver, brought into the headquarters, and then the CEO checks the quality of a total of 145 times 4 roles to make sure that they meet the high quality standards. So people didn't find that very useful, but the firm was not willing to compromise on these kind of quality controls. Now, managers actually turns out that managers have quite similar perception, and that's the store managers, of the usefulness of these checklists. As you see, there are some that they find very useful, like the expiry date checklist. Imagine they don't do the expiry dates, then you might eat a sandwich and be ill. That would be terrible. But they also believe that the daily protocol is medium useful and uses a lot of time, while they think that the operational checklist is one of the least useful, but also less time consuming. So that's the first step that we did. And to just give you an idea, this operational list, for instance, has this thing about a Berliner. So that's the Berliner donut. Please be mindful of the appearance of the Berliner donut. In a recent store visited, the sugar was partly scraped off on the side of a Berliner. Carefully touch it with a cake tongue on the side. Never touch it with a cake tongue on the top. Sugar might then be scraped off. Monitor other reasons why sugar is scraped off on Berliners. So that's the kind of stuff that a person who has been in this job for very long is very likely to find quite annoying. By the same time, the CEO cares a lot about the quality. At some point in time, when he was visiting the stores, he saw that some of these Berliners didn't look very good. He issued a checklist. That checklist stays, and it's the annoyance of the people who are trained and care a lot, while maybe for people who are less trained and care less, it might be an interesting signal that one should be careful about this. And that is also leading us to the main heterogeneity, which is really that we're going to see turnover of trained people, i.e., people who had vocational training or have experience, to go down when you remove the checklist in a statistically significant way, but turnover of untrained or less qualified people to go up, although statistically not significant, i.e., there might be a real trade-off in the use of checklists, and that's the core of this story. That's the daily protocol. You put in a lot of information. For instance, the bathroom might have a problem. You need a plumber, or the lamps are down, or one of the fridges is broken, or we had a problem with some workers who didn't show up, or tomorrow there will be a hygiene control. So that's the kind of stuff that you write down in the daily protocol and hand it over to the next shift. And as you see, that might be a lot of information, but it might also be more useful. Okay, so I can flip this and then go to the experiment itself. So top executives informed the regional managers. Each regional manager has like 40, between 30, no, let me not say something wrong. I think between 10 and 12 stores under their purview. The workers and stores managers will never know that it's an RCT, but they're totally used to being experimented with. The firm is experimenting all the time with new goods, new marketing material. So that's very usual in the retail business, that new stuff is coming in and not everybody is experimented with. So there's also a message from the COO to give this treatment a little bit of punch. We trust you. We want to use the extra time for customers and colleagues. And please see, we reduce the checklist because we believe you don't really need them. It's stratified, blah, blah, blah. You can all read that in the paper.
Yeah.
Yes.
Could you just quickly comment on this messaging from the COO? I'm just thinking in terms of
Yeah,
there's a kind of signal of trust there, and then there's the more sort of operational side of removing the checklist.
absolutely.
So there's kind of
Absolutely.
two different treatments going on there. So like, what's the?
I agree. I agree. I mean, I think it's one of these decisions that you take um, knowing that you will not be able, because of lacking statistical power, to disintegrate those two, right? To separate them. We cannot do this. I once did a nice study where I was too greedy with my statistical power and regretted it afterwards. So, but your point is absolutely well chosen. We discussed it a lot and we said we need to give this thing a bit of punch.
Yeah.
But in the end, the question is indeed, is it just the checklist or the combination of the two? I would say it's a combination of the two. I cannot tell you what would have happened without this message, you know. Yeah.
But then again, maybe it's also realistic, right? You wouldn't just, without announcement, take some operational things out. So in reality, that's just how it would probably go.
Yeah, that's a good point. You might get a lot of noise, right? Why the hell are they doing it? I mean, we have a management science paper where in a big supermarkets store, we just had the message of the CEO telling supermarket managers to take better care of their workers because the workers had such high turnover. And there was nothing in support of this, just a message, right? So these messages work, at least for a certain time, that's for sure. And that's all I can say. But you're right, it wouldn't be very natural to do that, and nobody even realizes that they've done it. You must inform people about it. Thank you. Good. So here's the overall impact. In the treatment stores, you get a 2.7% increase in sales. The sales go up roughly in the same magnitude, both in periods in which sales are slow and in periods in which sales are busy. You get a slight increase in customers, but that is not statistically significant, but I don't care that much about it. So a part of the increase in sales might be due to dealing faster with queues, and a part might be that somehow the product might be more appealing or something like that. Shrinkage is a very important indicator for retail business. Shrinkage is more or less how much you have to throw away or how much is stolen, and we don't see any effect in shrinkage. And also in the mystery shopping score, I could talk ages about mystery shopping. It's a very interesting monitoring thing that retailers use. We also don't see any change.
What is that exactly?
Mystery shopping is you employ people who pretend to be customers, but actually they go and fill out a report on the quality of service, the goods, cleanliness, and so on. And all retailers are using this. It's another control mechanism. Okay. So treatment versus control stores over time. In sales, I mean, we get what we would expect, that by and large, in the RCT period, we have higher sales, but then with a firm-wide rollout, they go down. So in a certain way, you undo part of the positive signal by bringing in one of the two checklists again. Better. So here's the employee attrition, and that tells us something about the heterogeneity that I was alluding to. First of all, the treatment has no average effect on attrition. So 0.07 is nil here, in particular at 0.24. But when you break it down, it gets interesting. When you break it down, you see that the untrained workers, so these are people who either don't even intend to have vocational training or are in vocational training but haven't yet concluded it. If anything, their turnover goes up. The trained workers are two kinds of workers. It's the trained non-managers and the trained managers. And you see that their attrition goes down. And actually, for the trained managers, it goes down so much that their turnover almost disappears. However, the trained managers are usually not turning over that much. So it is a very clean effect, but in terms of the magnitude, it's not a huge effect because these people are usually very loyal. But more or less what this story tells you is that, like in our model, where you would say if your psychological costs of being monitored are very high, and that's more likely for the ones that are trained because they will say, oh, I know what to do. It's insulting that you ask me to do these things. If these are very high, then it should be the trained guys who should show stronger effects. Did somebody want to ask something?
Yeah, so I just wanted to work out who exactly these checklists are. They only for the managers that are filling in the checklist, or what's the breakdown between manager and worker of checklist usage?
Very good, very good. I usually would go back now to the slide where I showed you the perceptions of managers and workers on the different checklists and the time they use per week. It is an interesting question. There are certain checklists that only the managers do, and there are other checklists that both workers and managers do. The ones that we took away are sort of shared between workers and managers. So some of them should, in principle, be done by the trained managers, but they farm it out to the employees. In the end, you don't know whether a piece of paper, for some, you know precisely it was the managers, but for many others, you don't know whether it's the employees or the managers. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Would it be fair to say that the managers tend to do more of the checklists, and that might speak to why?
Uh, I don't think that in their total. Okay, so maybe then I dare go back. Let me see here. So that is the store managers. They say, for instance, they spend 55 minutes per week on the daily protocol, but only 15 on the operational list, while the workers say they spend more or less the same time on the daily protocol and more on the operational checklist. So if anything, the workers say they spend more time on the checklist than the managers.
Is.
Okay? Which, I mean, in general, we don't find much evidence that the time, the safe time is really the trigger. Because if it were safe time, we would have also expected the treatment effects to be stronger in times of busy sales, and it's not really. Okay, good. Magnitudes. These magnitudes are not surprising. So in a paper almost 10 years ago about team incentives, again in bakeries, we found that team incentives led to a 3% increase in sales and customers. For retail, this is pretty good because retail is such a high fixed cost business that increasing 3% in sales or customers is good. Bloom et al. Found working from home leading to a 4% increase in calls per minute. Then in terms of turnover, Schuler, Allen, and Matthias Sutter and co-authors found in their QJE paper on relational interventions that turnover dropped by 80%. Attrition, worker attrition dropped by 80%. So somehow, it looks like we are in a reasonable ballpark in terms of the magnitudes. What happens to the worker's opinion? There is a positive. So these are all Likert scales. I don't remember anymore whether it was 5 or 7, to be honest. But these are somehow significant increases. Commitment to my store goes up in the treatment group. The perceived trust between the headquarters and the workers goes up. Now, you were totally right to say maybe this is because of the message. We cannot disentangle it. Maybe it is nice that the COO tells me that he likes me and trusts me. There are a few placebos we are using here to show that this is not increases all over the board, so it's not some kind of halo effects, but it's really related to what they do. The Google reviews work out nicely. In particular, the stars are okay. I don't put that much emphasis on the star increase. I find it more interesting that products get a slightly higher favorable rating by customers, and that also speed of service, if anything, goes up and not down. Okay. Now we can dig deeper into the heterogeneity, and that's probably what I like most about this paper. It's not only this heterogeneity in the attritions, but we can also think about who knows what in this organization. And before we did the treatment, before we even knew what the treatment state was, we asked the regional managers about their expectations, and they all made predictions for each store in the region. So do you think that this intervention would work? We were very cautious. Do you think this would work? And then we let them talk, and some of them are more talkative than others. And some of them say, yes, we think that this will work because it's a very experienced team. They don't like this sort of bureaucracy and control, and they will get along without it very well. So that's what we did, but we can also look at shop team size, shop team tenure, and worker reciprocity. So here are the results based on the regional manager's predictions, and it's a very simple sample split. So what we do is here we do split regressions by stores where managers predicted the RCT to work, and you clearly see when you compare that to the subsample where RCTs were predicted not to work, that the effects are very strongly concentrated in the upper half of the panel. So log sales go up by 5%, log busy sales and log slow sales roughly in the same ballpark. Customers go up by 5%, while again, shrinkage and mystery shopping scores are not affected at all. While in the ones where they predicted this not to work, it's totally flat. And I think this is very in particular that nothing else moves. So the shrinkage isn't affected, the mystery shopping isn't affected. Looks to me very much like these people have a pretty good technology of knowing where less control by checklists may be beneficial and where it may not be beneficial. And that's the graph for the stores where treatment was predicted to work and where treatment was not predicted to work. So that's pretty much of a smoking gun. These guys know their stores pretty well, it seems, and can build pretty precise expectations about removal of these checklists. Then in terms of attrition, again, it looks very, very similar. We get strong effects in attrition of the negative effect in terms of attrition of the trained workers, and a little bit of a mixed picture in terms of the untrained workers. So, a few questions about the heterogeneity by these regional manager predictions. So are regional managers just predicting success in higher performing stores? That's not the case. So we do machine learning models here, and what turns out to be really significant is the treatment times regional manager prediction coefficient is stronger for regional managers with greater tenure who arguably know more about their stores. So they have better knowledge about what's going on in the stores. Other than that, we don't find much in the machine learning that would be surprising. Let me see. Yes. So we also try to predict the predictions. They're not easy to predict. We can, that's not with machine learning. Once you throw in all kind of stuff, then you predict it well, but that is not very surprising. But if you run more like a regression on what you think should matter, then you cannot explain much of the variance of the predictions of the regional managers. So naturally, you want to know what the regional managers think is going on. And again, we let them talk, right? And we said, so again, do you think this will work or not? And if yes, why? And we really got two types of explanations, and some people use both. The first one is a utility explanation, such as people like not having the paperwork or they feel less stressed. And the second is a problem explanation in which they would say, oh, these guys, everything's under control, they don't need it. And both of these things we have in our little Mickey Mouse model. What else do we have? We don't find much heterogeneity based on team tenure. We don't find much on the time that the stores said they would use for the daily protocol. We tried a few things pointing to contamination. We looked at whether regional managers might have spent more time in treated stores, not the case. So we believe that the threats of validity are not very strong. And then finally, about the firm-wide rollout, we presented these results in the winter 2021. And that was an interesting discussion because in the project management group, some said, okay, let's just go on. That was a success. Others said, yeah, the daily protocol that might be quite useful, in particular for the untrained people. So we want to bring it in. Finally, we did bring it in. The sales effect then drops roughly by half, and the attrition effect evaporates. So sort of bringing it back again seems to undo part of the positive effects. So let me conclude, and that would also give us another 10 minutes or so of discussion. What do we learn from this? So I think the first thing that one should take into account, and that's also related to the initial comment about what does that mean in times of AI. There is a temptation to control people much more, in particular these days. Starbucks CEO, for instance, wants to make it mandatory for the, I think they call their people associates or something, to write down a nice little word on each cup of coffee. So to sort of standardize what in principle was a signal to people who you liked. If you are, you're a barista and there's a person who's very nice to you, you might put him a little word and say, oh, it's so nice that, or you know them, it's so nice that you're back, Christian or Matt or whatever. But the Starbucks CEO thinks that this should be like a standard procedure. And similarly, big tech firm do all kind of things to monitor their people. This might be technologically tempting, but it might have these sort of unexpected heterogeneous treatment effects that we are pointing out to. We find it interesting that the regional managers, i.e. the direct supervisors of the store managers, and also people who often go to these stores and talk to not only the store managers, but also other people in the store, they seem to know a lot of stuff. So one conclusion would be maybe you don't want to just centrally monitor whatever you can, but maybe you rather want to, within the organization, talk to people who are not at the top of the organization, but more at the middle and have more interaction with the workforce to hear about their perceptions of what's a good policy or what is not a good policy. And potentially you might even want to delegate the control intensity to these people. And that seems to be important. We finally would say checklists are incredibly popular, and there are these books on how great they are, and we would totally agree that they're great, and in particular to close down tail risks like in health or transportation, pilots and so on. But whether they are without costs in technologies where it's not a matter of life or death, but more of incremental potential improvements in product quality or so at the expense of, annoying people, is a question that used to be open, but I think we have contributed a little bit to it by saying this has effects on how the way how people behave in terms of attrition and so on. So there might be strong heterogeneities that each firm should consider. And final word is it is interesting to see that different firms in the same industry, like in retail, have quite different philosophies on how to deal with this sort of monitoring intensity. Maybe one thing that I would like to pick out is the how generalizable is this, with this hold for other firms or jobs. The firm is a sizable player in Germany, but arguably, bakery industry is not the largest industry in the world. We checked whether other firms do similar things. We interviewed a few managers from 5 other German bakery chains. It looks quite similar. Maybe they use a little bit less of these checklists, but all 5 chains do use checklists. To what extent is this an interesting study for other retail firms? It is for other restaurant chains and so on. McDonald's, KFC, and all these guys are incredibly micromanaging, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that people are not always happy about that, but we're lacking any kind of RCTs on removing that sort of control in these bigger chains. So this is what I wanted to say, and I'm happy to hear whether you have any more comments.
I have a question. Perhaps we should look for the one in the chat first. You can see that.
Yes, that would be nice. Yeah, please do so.
I'll read it out as well. The question is, maybe checklists undermine intrinsic motivation, which stems from the feelings of competence, autonomy, and relatedness. If those feelings could be addressed, maybe the negative psychological risk would be reduced. So that's
yeah, no, that's a good point. I think in many circumstances, I would say you're right. Here, the degree of autonomy is relatively limited to start with. I think the sort of autonomy you have is probably in the interaction with the client. You can be more friendly or less friendly. Note that in some checklists, they were also saying always be friendly or always say, Hallo, wie geht es Ihnen? I cannot imagine that you will not say, hello, how are you, just because the checklist asks you to do it. In terms of products, the autonomy is very low. I mean, it's very precisely defined what a sandwich looks like. It's very precisely defined how many grams of strawberries should be on a strawberry cake. You cannot put more and you shouldn't put less. So I take the comment as a general comment for this, absolutely. In this circumstance, it's probably a secondary channel.
I had a question, Guido, on. I was thinking about this question of sort of how to interpret your results in the sense of a marginal effect, because this seemed to be a very sort of high control environment. That scatter plot had, I don't know how many checklists, but like 24 or was it 30? And it's sort of just from, I mean, obviously very difficult to study in this context, but kind of knowledge of the literature on removing 2 checklists from a context where there are a very large number of checklists. Like, do we expect the marginal effect to differ? Because I guess you could make the sort of ex-ante case 2 ways. You could think of it as one intrusive checklist already breaks a lot of trust, and then the impact on trust of additional checklists is small. Or you could think of it as kind of non-linear, that each one, and at some point workers just get sick of being monitored, and there's like. Yeah. Are we thinking it would be higher or lower in this context compared to somewhere where there was less monitoring to start with?
Yeah, that's also very interesting. I mean, I think I very briefly talked about the literature in particular in labs, but also to some extent in the field on monitoring. And I don't think it's very surprising to see that monitoring has costs and benefits, right? And we have studied these a little bit. I would say, in one way, one could say it is surprising that even the marginal effects are so clean. Maybe this is a way to make sense of it. We might have expected you need to do much more than just removing a few. You might need to change the culture from a control culture to a more, less controlly or much less controlly culture. So I think that also given what I saw in the employee surveys that they had done even before we came in, many people talked about an excess of checklists and not about a general problem with monitoring. People in retail are used to be monitored all the time. It seems that at the margin, this might become very costly, and it's a little bit like enough is enough. But I think that this will be very different between different industries.
Yeah.
And that's all I can say. I mean, it's absolutely clear that if you're talking about tail risks, you probably want to make sure that you check so many things to reduce uh, the mistakes you can make to zero, because otherwise people die. But you cannot do that in an environment where people will not die if occasionally the sugar is scraped off the donut.
And just does this speak a bit to this question of that? Is this about a signal of trust that you remove to a checklist? The CEO says it, and like that seems to be like something that adds credibility to this statement. And I'm not sure if they're kind of looking along those lines. If that's
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I recommend reading this Ellingson and Johannesson piece. It might have other applications also in other firms. I think it's a very subtle argument to think that workers might care about how their clients and how their boss perceives them. We care about how our students perceive us, right? And we care about how our provost or whatever might see us as a good citizen or not. And we should be very careful in not sending the wrong signals about how people are perceived. And in universities, there's a little bit too much of this control going on these days, I guess.
Thinking about the survey you sent out to the workers and the managers beforehand, could there be some role of feeling listened to in some manner? So they obviously reported that they didn't enjoy these surveys, and then the treatment groups had them removed. So could there be some kind of feeling of perhaps even autonomy there, or could that be an effect as well, coupled with the CEO sending a nice message? It's not just that something changed, but it's something changed in response to what they asked for, which...
Yeah, I like that. That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, employee voice, I guess, is an important thing, and we're thinking more about this, right? Um, uh, yes, I agree. I cannot disentangle it, but I agree. I would just full-heartedly say yes. Good point.
Was everyone surveyed entirely, or perhaps some people think they were less, because you showed us the mean of how important these checklists were. Could you disaggregate slightly there and think about people that didn't care about the survey? Did they check, or if a store was a bit different, maybe you could dig into it. But
yeah, I mean, remember the pre-research survey is the typical employee engagement survey that we see in, any halfway decently managed firm, right? But people have this. What I liked about these guys is they really speak up, right? I mean, they very often these engagement surveys are so incredibly boring. I don't know whether any of you guys work on these things, and the variation in these engagement scores is so ridiculous. And big firms are spending all this money on them, and they have big providers doing that. These guys, I mean, they were so surprised about the feedback they got in the survey, in particular the CEO, because it was so blunt and outspoken. Don't treat us like children. We know what we do. So I think you're right. I mean, there's very likely a part of this. So finally, these guys listen. That's good news.
But it's unlikely that this is confounding, because you estimate the effect over 10. The effect is not going down. So if this is sort of like an initial push of trust that we listen to you, but it's probably not like lasting for 10 months.
That's a very good point. And I would recommend anybody who runs RCTs with firms to strategically do this in a way that they hang in. I think the fundamental problem in many of the experiments is, as we all know, there's a short-term effect, and then we leave and blah, and it's all just because finally somebody did something and not really this thing. This is very persistent. So whenever you can hang in, and we can talk another time about how to hang in, you shouldn't release all the good results in the very first meeting, like 2 months after the RCT. Make sure that they understand that it's incredibly complicated to analyze all the data, and you will later on give them more information so that you can really stay in, and then let them decide whether they want or they do not want to do a rollout. And rollouts are very informative. And you should still say, and we need to look at the rollout for at least a few months so that you can be sure that you've done the right thing. So that is the icing on the cake to finish the bakery stupidity.